So, good morning. Welcome to Dreamforce. Are you happy? Are you having a good time? Oh, come on. That's not having a good time. Anyway, I hope you like this session. This is Introduction to Apex Triggers. So, my name is Luis Campos. I work for Salesforce on the tooling API team. And I've been using the platform for the last a little bit more than 8 years. It's been really fun. Triggers are really cool, so I hope you're gonna like this. So, first things first, Salesforce is a publicly traded company, so if we do any forward-looking statements, please do not make your purchase decisions based on that, just on things that we've released. So, the agenda for today is we're going to go through what's an Apex trigger, when and why to use it. We'll do a small code demo, and then we'll go through design considerations when writing triggers. We'll be showing you how to test a trigger, which is pretty cool. And then I'll show you how to actually deploy the code that we're going to show you into any other environment to your production stuff. And then I'm going to leave like 10 minutes for any questions that you might have. Also, another thing, I'm going to make available this code that I'm going to demo. It's on a Git repo. It's ready for you to deploy to any sandbox or production environment. Yeah, and that's it. That's the agenda. So let's start by being everyone on the same page. Who's written like a custom field on the platform before? Can you raise your hands? Oh, you really like the platform? Workflow rules? Cool. Code? Any type of code. Not Apex, any type of code. Okay. Apex? Anyone here? Triggers before? Cool, cool. Okay, so let's start by saying what's Apex. So basically Apex is an object-oriented programming language, very similar to Java, but it's for the Salesforce platform. It's a multi-tenant programming language. And the cool thing about Apex is that we make sure that whenever you deploy your code, it's not affected by someone else's code, and vice versa. So why do we like Apex? So Apex runs in the cloud, and the cloud is cool, right? It's also very closely integrated with your data. So Apex gives you the ability to start creating controllers and triggers and immediately query your data and enrich your Visualforce pages, your Lightning components, all of your applications that you're writing on the platform. It's also got a testing framework, so we're going to provide you with a testing framework to make things easier for you when you're coding your app. And so you can make sure that your app runs as expected on any environment. The other thing about Apex is that it's backwards compatible. So I don't know if you know, but Apex is versioned. We're currently releasing version 37. So if you write something right now, it will work as it's working right now on any other version in the future. We make sure that it's always backwards compatible, so you won't have to worry about rewriting your application because they released a new version. It's not compatible with the code that you wrote a year or 2, 5 years ago. It's going to run the same way right now or in the future. So I mentioned multi-tenant, and just give me a minute to explain this. So let's say that we all live on a building, an apartment building. We're kind of familiar with that, right? Okay, so we live on an apartment, we have neighbors, and we have resources that we share on the building, hence the washing machine. So as a neighbor, I go to the washing machine, I put my clothes on, I wash them, and I immediately take them out so the other neighbor is able to use them. That's basically multi-tenancy. It's sharing resources, it's playing along with others nicely. That's multi-tenancy. So now, what's a trigger? So a trigger is basically custom Apex code that fires when you create, update, or delete a record. That's it. It's as simple as that. Now, this happens when you save the record, actually on your OR. But that's not the only thing that happens when you do that. So the platform does a bunch of things when you're saving a record. And what happens is like 14 different things that you don't need to memorize or anything. There's plenty of documentation on that. On this session, we'll just be focusing on the third and the seventh step, which is basically the before triggers and the after triggers. So there's two types of triggers, before and after. And basically, the before triggers get executed before the data gets saved into the database, and the after triggers get executed after the save on the database happens, okay? Now, something to keep in mind is you can have like a bunch of triggers that you write on an object, and you do not control the order of execution of these triggers, meaning if I write a trigger for a contact object, and I have 2 before triggers, I cannot depend on trigger A executing before trigger B, okay? So whenever you write your trigger code, you need to write it with the assumption that it needs to execute in its own way and without depending on any previous or after execution. So when should we use triggers? The platform gives you plenty of options to do similar logic than triggers. And this is like workflows, visual workflow, and processes. And I'll go a little bit into detail after this on those options. But basically, if you can do it declaratively, meaning point and click, you should not write triggers. And the reason is, if you write code, you need to maintain it, you need to write tests. It's a little bit slower to deploy, and it's also a little bit harder for your admins to be able to update your application. So it's easier to just have declarative whenever you can. And basically, trigger should be your last option. So the other options. The other options are workflows, which basically you can update fields, you can assign tasks, you can send emails, you can send outbound messages. We also have visual workflows, which is a wizard kind of flow, meaning, this is user triggered. So whenever a user on your org clicks to save or update a record, you can pop in like a small wizard and get more data from them and enrich the experience. So for example, if you're doing like a form kind of flow on an object and you need more data that you're not necessarily asking at the beginning of the form, you can use visual workflows to drive this experience. The other option is processes, which are built with the process builder on the platform. These are they're similar to workflows, but they're more powerful. You can create records with this and child records. You cannot do that with workflows. You can launch other flows, meaning other visual flows. You can post things to Chatter. You can submit for approvals. You can update other records. They are very, very cool. The only caveat here is that when you use processes, validation rules don't get executed. So you need to be very careful when you use this, because you could potentially be creating corrupt data on your org, or not that valid data on your org. So what do triggers excel at? You can build very robust code with triggers. You can have very flexible error handling, meaning if there's any error, you can display very gracefully messages to your users that are better for their experience. You could also write them in a way that you can support partial operations, meaning if you're saving or updating a bunch of records at a time and one fails, not the whole transaction is failing, just that one will fail. You can also write test code for them. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a test framework. You can write a bunch of tests around them, so it basically enhances your code and makes sure that it works as it should be. And also you leverage the power of Apex. So if you need to do complex calculations, if you need to call external services, you can do that with triggers. So let's go to the demo. Okay, so I basically built a small session management application, very similar to Dreamforce, where you have sessions, you have speakers, and you're trying to pair sessions with speakers. And I wrote a trigger, and so there's 3 objects: speaker, session, and the junction object between session and speaker. And I wrote the trigger that basically validates that whenever you're joining a session with a speaker, the speaker doesn't have a conflicted session already booked, okay? So we're on the session record right now, and I have no related speakers to it, and I'm gonna create one. So when I choose the speaker, I have 2 speakers on my system. I have myself and I have John. So John is already scheduled to a previous session. So if I click save here, I should get an error message that says like, hey, John is already booked in this session, okay? So I'll show you that code right now. Can you see this? Okay, so this is how you write a trigger. So the first thing that you notice is the syntax of it. I call it trigger, and then I call the trigger whatever I want to call it. In this case, I just called it session speaker trigger. And then I declare upon which object this trigger is executing, okay? And then what I put there is in which times it's gonna be executing. So I'm gonna get executed before I insert the data, before I update it, and after this gets inserted, this data gets inserted, okay? So now, triggers provide you with some context variables. And these are the ones that I'm talking about, like is before, is insert, is update, is after. And this is very cool because you basically say, I want this code to only execute before it gets inserted or before it gets updated. That's it. So it doesn't conflict with other code that you might have there. So the first thing that I do is I have some data structures because I'm going to start bulkifying my code. And bulkifying is very important with triggers. So you don't want to write your trigger in a way that it only is able to process one record at a time. Because, for example, if you're using data loader, you'll be loading more than one record at a time, right? So if your trigger is written that way, you'll end up running into governor limits, and it's going to take a bunch of time for you to execute these things. So bulkifying our code means just writing your code in a way that it gets it can execute more than one record at a time. That's it. So I have these data structures there where I'm going to be storing stuff and then querying for stuff. So the first thing that I do is I go over the records that I'm saving, and this is provided by trigger.new. These other context variables that are provided out of the box. This basically gives you all of the records that you're executing at the time. So I iterate over them, and I start saving the session ID and the speaker ID. So once I got that, I basically query for all the session information here using the key that I have on the map, okay? And then I start storing the date, because the date is basically what I'm gonna use to validate whether the speaker has a previous session that is conflicting or not. So once I do that, I query for all the existing speakers and the sessions that they're currently doing. So once I've got that, I iterate again over the records. And I start validating one speaker, one session at a time. And whenever I find any conflict, I basically just throw an error message and I say, this speaker is already booked at this time. You can't save it. And this is basically what we just saw here, okay? So let me just select a speaker that doesn't have any conflict, and the transaction goes through, okay? So now, if we go back to the code, I'll show you something that executes after the speaker gets inserted. And this is basically, I'm just sending an email. That's it. I'm just sending an email that says, hey, speaker X, you're booked for this session. Thank you for joining Dreamforce. So again, I have the context variables, and this code is only executed after it gets inserted. And then I just like iterate over the records. I get the speaker IDs, the session speaker IDs, and I just get the data for the session and the speakers so I can start building my email. And this is what you see here on this query. So once I have all of this data, the only thing that I do is I iterate over the sessions that I just booked the speaker for, and I start building the email template in case the email is valid or in case the speaker actually has an email record. If it doesn't have an email record, it doesn't make sense for me to try to send an email, okay? So if I show you my email, I should have an email record. So here it is. Dear Luis, your session lightning readiness is confirmed. Thanks for speaking, which is basically what I wrote here, okay? So now, this is just like the trigger, and we just built the trigger out of nothing, right? So let me show you how you test the trigger. So this is how you test the trigger. So you should have the assumption that whenever you're writing a test, you are not using your production data. Whenever you're creating tests, you need to create data for that test. And that's what I'm doing here on the first lines. So I created a utility just to create data that's similar to the data that I have on my data model and on my org. So the first thing that I do is I create a user, and I set the admin profile for that user. Then I create sessions. I create 2 sessions, and I create 1 speaker. So afterwards, here in line 12, I just basically start running the test as if I was the admin user that I just created for this test. And then I create the junction object for one of the sessions and the speaker. And these tests should go through. These tests should be like a green test. Like you're able to save a record if all the conditions are met. And you basically just assert this. On the second scenario, I'm just basically doing a negative test on my trigger, meaning I want to test that I'm actually throwing the error message that I wrote on it. So I create 2 sessions that are running at the same time, and I create 1 speaker, and I already have a junction object for one of the sessions and the speaker. So when I try to book the speaker for the second session, I should be able to get an error message that says the speaker is already booked at that time, okay? So if we go back to the org and we open the developer console, now I'm gonna be running my test. So basically, I just pick it, I run it, it starts running, and it's a successful run. So every blue line here means that line of code has been tested. So if you can look here, the code that I just wrote for the trigger has 100% coverage, meaning everything that we wrote is completely testable with the code that I just showed you, okay? So now we're ready to deploy this code, right? So once we have the code ready, we wrote the code, we wrote the test, everything is working nicely and as we want. We have 2 options to get it to another sandbox, another org, or a developer org, a production org. We have the Salesforce migration toolkit, which is Ant-based. You basically go to your org, you download the jars, you start writing some Ant tasks, and you just basically deploy it via your command line. That's one option. The second option is change sets. So change sets are more UI-based. Imagine that you're just building a small package on the UI where you just put the code that you just updated and you just select which org you're going to deploy that to. So I can be on my developer sandbox and I say, the code is ready, let me deploy it to production. I create an outbound change set. I select the production org as the destination. I send it to production org, and then I log into my production org as an admin. I look for that outbound message. I run the tests, and now my code is installed in production. It's as simple as that. And well, this is the end. These are the resources. The code is available on that Git repo. It's ready for deploy. I wrote some Ant tests, some Ant tasks that you can use there. And there's a couple of trailheads stuff that you can go through, introduction to triggers and the process automation, which basically allows you to have a more conscious decision on which feature of the platform you want to use other than triggers. And I think, yeah, we're done. Any questions? Yeah.
Testing.
That's not actually creating any data. It's not actually creating a user test, right? It's just sort of doing it virtually.
So the question is, when I wrote the test and I'm creating the data, is it actually creating the test data and the user? And the answer is yes, but on the test context. So this doesn't take any licenses away from you, for example. You're not actually creating a user on your org. You're creating it on a test context, and it never gets created on the org itself. Yes, once. Correct. It's not making any changes on your test, on your org data. It's basically completely isolated on a test context. And whenever the test finishes its execution, the data goes away.
So when you write it, then you just kind of write it side by side with the trigger so that you can look and see, like, okay, my trigger's doing this one, so I need to do
Well,
this on a session, so I need to have that session.
so the question is, whenever I'm writing a test code, do I write it side by side with my trigger code, or do I just like do it on another way? And that basically depends on the developer. There's developers that like to do tests before they write the actual code, which is basically just test-driven development. And there are developers that take the code and like to have it side by side while they're running, while they're writing their tests. There's other people that like to write tests as very similar to the business cases that were provided to them. So for example, if you tell a developer like, hey, this trigger needs to be sending an email only in this scenario, they'll write a test case specifically for that scenario that you described to them. But it's basically up to the developer. Yeah? Yes. Oh, the question is, when do you use set versus map versus list? It basically really depends on you. The list is great to just like store a list of records. I personally use a set when I'm storing things like IDs or like names of records that I don't want to be duplicated. I don't need to check for that logic on my own. Like the set already provides you for that. And the map is basically very similar to a set, but you get to store other things next to it. So for example, if I'm storing the IDs for records and I need additional data for those records, I would have the ID be the key of the map, and then the data of the record be the value for it. Yeah, on the back. So the question is, why did it have to be before insert, before update, and before insert, and not only on one context? Okay, so, sorry.
Your example was checking beforehand if he's already scheduled for a session, why do we after?
Oh, okay. So is the question, why did we do some stuff in before and some stuff afterwards, right? Okay, so before, let me show you the slide again. Where is it? So if you take a look at the way that the platform executes certain stuff, when I execute the before triggers, the data is not saved on the database yet. Meaning, if I'm inserting a junction object that's relating a session with a speaker, I want to do the validations before that data gets to the database, right? So that's the reason for those things. Now the email thing, I only want to send the email once those validations go through and the record is actually saved on the database. So I don't want to send an email and then like run into an issue when saving it, and I've already confirmed the speaker that has the session, when in reality I wasn't able to create the record. It's just that.
In that scenario, you had one trigger with before and after, so does that same trigger get called twice, before and after? Or is it just that what triggered is called once and then the logic goes in it?
So the question is, I had before and after on the same trigger code.
Right.
Does it get executed every time that you execute the trigger? That's the question?
I guess the trigger would get called twice then, during the before and then also during the after?
Correct. So if you look at the code, the trigger is always called, but the context variables are the ones that allow you to either enable that code for execution or not. That's why I'm using before and after. And then I control the before and after to basically say I want to execute it before the insert and before the update, or after the insert.
And you could have just as well split it up into two triggers, one that, and not have the if statements inside, right? The before trigger and the after trigger.
Sure, I could have split this into two separate triggers. The only thing is I would have had to declare this. Let's say that we split this into the before trigger, and we call this session speaker before trigger, right? it will just look like this, before insert, before update. The reason why I did it this way is it gives you more flexibility. Also, if you write it this way and your application starts evolving, the developers don't need to start guessing whether this code needs to get executed or not. It's clearer for a developer to just build upon things that are properly structured. So I just did it this way because it's easier for me to expand my application without affecting the logic that I already wrote and I already tested. It's just that. Yep.
Is the test required to deploy?
So the question is the test required to deploy to production? Yes, we require a 75% code coverage on your code, and that's why I thought it was really valuable to provide test code for this. Any other questions? Yep.
If you need to use the ID in your logic, is there a way to get to it in a before insert?
If I need to, sorry, if I need to use the ID,
ID of the record, is there a way to get to what it's going to be in a before insert?
If they're creating a new record
yes.
and they haven't been assigned an ID yet, is there a way to look at what that ID is doing?
Oh, do you want to know if I can predict the ID on the, you shouldn't do that. So this is the thing. Let me expand on that. The reason, the IDs are generated by the platform itself. And sometimes you can assume that they're going to be created in a ordered way. But if you start doing transactions where you save, where you delete, then you lose track of the order in which this ID is going to be created. So it's really not predictable for me or for anyone to say this is going to be the ID that's going to get assigned to it. If you need to provide an ID on your logic, then you're basically looking at building it on an after basis, where basically the record is already saved on the database and the ID is already generated, and it's already accessible to you via the trigger.new or trigger.new map. Any other question? Yep.
How does the system know that you're testing the trigger? Like how?
So the question is, how does the system know that I'm testing the specific trigger code, right? Okay. So whenever you're building a test, this gets executed on a test context that's basically using also the Apex compiler of the platform. So the Apex compiler is the one that's relating your test code with the code that you're testing and how every single line that's getting executed via your test. That's how it happens. It's all internal. Okay, I guess that's it. Thanks so much.